All right, well, thank you so much. And I want to thank you all for joining this presentation today. I especially want to thank the East Hampton Library and Andrea for inviting me to present. And this discussion was actually planned to be done in person back in March, but like so many other events, we had to cancel. So I'm really excited to be able to do this Zoom presentation today. And I wasn't sure who my audience was going to be, so I tried to make this a general presentation about archaeology and what we do at the Fowler House. So today, I'll be talking about archaeology at the Fowler House in East Hampton. Now, if you live in East Hampton, you may have passed by the house on Springs Fireplace Road. The photo on the right shows the house since it was renovated in 2018. And the photos on the left show the condition of the house in the years prior to the renovation. Archaeology was done at this site before the house was renovated. Hold on. There we go. So I'm a professional archaeologist with VHB Engineering, Surveying, Landscape Architecture, and Geology. And as an archaeologist, I provide a unique service in the fields of engineering, environmental permitting, and construction. And that is to determine if new construction may impact buried archaeological sites. People don't typically think of archaeology as being a part of construction and engineering, and not every construction project has archaeology done at the site. But the work that I do is regulated by environmental laws at the federal, state, and local level that are designed to review whether or not an archaeological site might be impacted by new building projects. Now, the archaeological work at the Fowler House was commissioned by the town of East Hampton when the landmarked Fowler House was undergoing renovation. So this slide shows what the house looked like in 2014. And that was when it was owned by Suffolk County. So at that time, the Suffolk County Parks Division of Historic Services discovered that the county had owned this property in the 1990s for taxes owed. So it was in 2014 that the Division of Historic Services for Suffolk County Parks learned of the history of the house. The Division of Historic Services presented a case for the preservation of the site to the Suffolk County Council for Environmental Quality, or the CEQ, who recommended to the legislature that site ownership be transferred to the town of East Hampton, who would preserve the property as a historic site and work with the Montauk Indians to develop an interpretive program. These guidelines were laid out in a resolution that was passed by the legislature around 2014 or 15. And from that point on, the East Hampton Town Supervisor worked with a group of local advocates to ensure that the site was landmarked, protected, and renovated. In 2018, the house was renovated by Ben Krapinski Builders, who donated time and materials for the building's renovation. And during that renovation process, the advocacy group called the Friends of the Fowler House requested that the town hire an archaeologist to investigate beneath the floor of the house to recover artifacts and archaeological information before the renovation proceeded. Everyone knew that after the house was renovated, we'd no longer have access to those deposits. So VHB was hired to do the archaeological investigation. So let's take a look briefly at where the site is located. For those of you who may be joining in from out of state, or even for those of you who live up island, here's a map of Long Island. At the far eastern tip of the South Fork, you can see Montauk, right over here in this box. Montauk is the ancestral home of the Montauk Indians. There were village settlements there from several thousands of years ago until the end of the 1800s, or the end of the 19th century. So I've identified several places on this map that are important to understanding the history and the kin connections of the Montauk Indians. One of those places is Freetown, pointed out here north of the village of East Hampton, right over here. You can see that. Now this next map shows more clearly the location of the Fowler site on Springs Fireplace Road in East Hampton, right over here. So it's located north of the village of East Hampton. So what is the Fowler House and why is it important? Well, the Fowler House was the home of George and Sarah Fowler, their children, their grandchildren, and their extended family from 1885 to 1980. And around 1980, the last resident of the house, Leonard Horton, who was George and Sarah's grandson, had died. After that time, no one lived in the house and the taxes weren't paid. That's how the house eventually ended up on the county real estate list. But in 1885, George and Sarah Fowler lived here and they raised their 7 children in this house. So a lot of the historic photos that I get to show you throughout this presentation are all courtesy of the East Hampton Library Long Island collection. So I highly encourage anybody who's interested in this history to check out the records there. So this house is really important because it is a material reminder of the Montauk Indian presence. And it's a resource for us to understand the Native American lived experience between 1885 and 1980. At this site, one Montauk family's stories can be told in the context of Montauk tribal recognition, Native American lifeways in the past, and Freetown neighborhood history. Significantly, this is the only landmarked Montauk site, and even more significantly, this site is directly connected to the time when New York State detribalized the Montaukets. That is, when the New York State courts told the Montaukets and the world that they no longer exist. So here is a circa 1920s photo of George Fowler, shown in the center, with some of his family members. He would have been in his 60s at this time. He's shown with his daughter Marguerite to the left of him and his sister Mariah to the right. In the back, from left to right, are his brother Charles, his son John, his niece Pocahontas, and his nephew Sam. George Fowler was born at Indian Fields, the Montaukett ancestral village in Montauk, around 1859. He grew up there in Montauk with his parents William and Mary Fowler, and his brother Charles, pictured here, and several other siblings who aren't in the photo. At that time, his sister Mariah was living in her own household with her husband, Chief David Farrow, and their children, Wyandanch, Maggie, Samuel Powhatan, Ebenezer Tecumseh, and Pocahontas, all at Indian Fields. These two families were living at Indian Fields, as well as a few others, until the early 1880s, when they were all evicted from their homes. Now, at that time, in the 1880s, Arthur Benson, who was a wealthy businessman from Brooklyn, purchased roughly 10,000 acres of Montauk land at public auction for about $151,000. And according to a town restriction that accompanied the sale, Benson was expected to respect the rights of the Montaukets to live at Indian Fields in perpetuity, even though he owned all the land around them. But as soon as Benson purchased the land, he hired local people to help him negotiate the sale of individual Montaukett residency rights to him. In exchange, he would offer the Montaukets small plots of land in Freetown. He didn't want the Montaukets living on the land that he purchased, even though they retained rights to live there through an agreement with the town. So he tried to offer individual Montaukets who were living at Freetown, who were living at Indian Fields at the time, small sums of cash and property to move them off the land. The terms were misleading, as the Montaukets testified in court that they were told they could return to their homes as they had for hundreds of years before, but this was not the case. Here you can see a photo of the Farrow and the Fowler families at Indian Fields in Montauk. Pictured here is a younger George Fowler, with members of his extended family, the last Montaukett residents of Indian Fields, before they were all dispossessed of their ancestral home and relocated to Freetown. But these men and women would certainly not be the last Montaukets, as their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren are alive and well throughout Long Island and abroad, and hopefully some of them may even be tuned into this presentation today. So some of the Montaukett homes were moved from Montauk to Freetown. This receipt, which is preserved in the Long Island collection of the East Hampton Library, shows a bill for removing Mariah's house and Aurelia's house, as it's stated at the top of the receipt. A note on the receipt from one of the librarians also says that the rest were burned. So based on this history, questions have developed regarding the age and history of the Fowler house in Freetown. Was it one of the homes moved from Indian Fields? Was it a building that was moved from elsewhere in East Hampton? Or was it built on site by Benson for Fowler? Now, fortunately, because the Fowler site is from the recent past, we don't have to rely exclusively on documents or their interpretation. We can learn about its history from living Fowler descendants as well, who have a direct connection to the site and have family narratives that involve the residents. We can learn from the building structure itself, how old parts of the building are. And we can learn from the archaeology about how the site was built and used by the Fowler family. And this is why archaeology is important at historic sites, like the Fowler House. The archaeology can provide information that helps us understand the lived experiences of people in the past. It can shed light on narratives that are typically left out of our national and our regional histories. So archaeological investigations were done at the Fowler House during a very cold week of March 2018. We were able to get on site after much of the historic and recent fabric of the building were removed as the building was getting ready for renovation, including the floor. So this photo shows some of the condition of the house as materials were being removed from it. This photo shows the back of the house on the right, which at the time had the rear wall removed. So archaeologists worked inside the house to dig beneath the floor beams. And you can see in this photo that I'm excavating in the right, in the room that was used as a kitchen. My coworker, Ray, was digging in the bedroom to the left. And outside the house, Mark was sifting through the dirt to recover artifacts. And these would have been items that were dropped and lost between the floorboards. So artifacts are items that are made and left behind by humans, and they make their way down into the dirt and eventually get covered up by the new dirt that gets tossed on the surface from natural processes like wind, rain, decay, and erosion. Because the Fowler House sat on fieldstone corners, there would have been movement from these processes, as well as small animals and rodents between the building floor and the surface of the soil below. So on the left, you see a collection of artifacts with dirt as it's being sifted through the screen. And on the right are buttons and a piece of mica that were recovered from the screen. Now, because the house was lived in at Freetown, at its Freetown location by only Fowlers and their descendants, the integrity of the house and its associated archaeological deposits are uniquely intact. There was no stone or brick foundation as the house sat on fieldstone corners, and there was no cellar or basement. These were features that we were looking for archaeologically. Although some structural changes were made during the 20th century, including a small south addition, some reconstructions of the porch, and some patchwork stabilization to the interior walls, other than that, there really were no substantial changes that had been made. And even through the 20th century, minimal utilities were introduced to the site. Electrical lines were visible throughout the house, but there were no bathrooms in the house, no connections to public or well water, and heating was provided by a centrally located stove. These were the conditions of the house when it was seized by Suffolk County for taxes owed in the 1990s, after the last resident and descendant of the house, Leonard Horton, had died in 1986. So the archaeologists, we were called to the site after construction had started. So there was a bit of disturbance that we had to work around the perimeter of the site. So you can see at this point, when we got there, the house had been lifted and the fieldstone corners had been removed. So much of the perimeter of the house was dug out for new cement footings, which you can see, to support the renovation. So this really hindered our ability to identify what's called a builder's trench, if it was there. And there were bricks from a feature called a dry well that were also removed that we didn't get to see before they were taken out. So this sort of complicated the work that was done at the site. But one of the goals of the archaeology was to try and sort out some of the issues of construction. And because the house was built of a mix of 18th, 19th, and 20th century construction materials, it proved difficult to attempt to date the house. But archaeological work sought clues through site formation processes to discern whether the house was constructed on site or relocated onto the site. Our biggest challenge with this was the disturbance to the perimeter of the house that was caused by the construction workers. So we weren't able to look for some of the features that we would ordinarily look for. But through analogical reasoning in historical archaeology, which is reasoning by example, we were able to provide more information to at least challenge the idea that the building was constructed in this location based on an agreement between George Fowler and Nathaniel Dominy, who was an agent for Arthur Benson. Let me see. Oh, and this is the brick feature that was sort of on the edge of the house, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. But this was also, we didn't get a chance to document this before the construction began at the site. So what you see here is a historic photo on the left of the Fowler house, and on the right is an agreement that's on file at the East Hampton Library that states that George Fowler, would give up all of his rights, title, and intent to Montauk, and in exchange he would receive a house and land at Freetown plus $50, and he would continue to receive his share of a $240 annuity for Montauk rights yearly and every year to be paid to his heirs forever. So this document raises many questions about the negotiations that Benson engaged with the Montaukets who were living at Indian Fields. One of those questions is if the house standing at Indian Fields was, if the house standing at Freetown was constructed to match up with the description in this document, or if this or if this document can be used to argue that the house was not moved from Indian Fields. Okay, so what we wanted to do in this instance was to explore the possibilities of whether or not this house could have been moved, or if it indeed was moved from Indian Fields, which is a tough thing to be able to explain archaeologically, but we did refer to different kinds of information to give us a better sense of the site. So, for instance, it was not uncommon for houses to be moved through East Hampton in the late 19th century during this period. In fact, just a half mile to the south, we could find another house that was moved to its current location during the very same time period. And that is the Jonathan Barnes Selah Lester house, which was moved to its current location at the corner of North Main Street and Cedar Street in 1874. Like the Fowler house, this house sits on fieldstone corners and lacked a cellar until the 20th century when a partial basement was dug for heating and utilities. And interestingly, this property is also owned by the town, so it provides some good comparisons between the two sites. We also examined the dimensions of the Fowler house and compared them to the dimensions of the house included in the agreement that was drawn between Fowler and Benson, as well as comparative data on other house sizes. So for instance, the document notes that Fowler and his heirs would receive $240 annually and a 1.5 acre parcel at Freetown, adjoining the homestead of George Bennett upon the southeast side and the Fireplace Highway. Also a dwelling house to be erected upon said land, 14 square, with a kitchen and a bedroom 7 feet and 8 feet each, 12-foot posts, the house and bedroom to be furnished at the cost not to exceed $50, and an additional $50 to be paid to him when this bargain is consummated. So it's a tricky document to read through, right, because of the way the writing was written at the time. But it closes with the point that George Fowler would agree to give up all of his rights and title and interest to Montauk in exchange for the property and the house and the payments. So if we look at the measurements of the house compared to the document, we find that the Fowler house measures 15 by 21 feet, not including the small later addition to the south elevation in the vicinity of the kitchen, which measured roughly 8.2 by 8.2 feet and would not have been referenced in this document. The house also includes a front porch, 7.5 by 15 feet. Now from the photo, you can see that the Fowler house is a salt box house with a porch added to the front, possibly at a later time. And perhaps this porch was added to accommodate what was stated in the document, that they wanted posts to the front of the house. But the dimensions of the house aren't a perfect match with the agreement. Now, fortunately, we have the benefit of comparative residential data from Indian Fields in Montauk. So we have several house patterns that were identified by archaeologists working there in the 1970s. And the data from 2 of those homes was the subject of my 2015 dissertation. One of the homes that was investigated archaeologically was the house that George Fowler grew up in. It was his parents, William and Mary Fowler's home. Now that house was constructed around 1840. It measured 15 by 24 feet, and it had a dry laid fieldstone foundation, but no cellar. So a lot of strong similarities in the size and layout of the building at Freetown. And it's also worth noting that the chimney bricks were missing from the site. So it's possible that bricks were also recycled from Indian fields and used at buildings in Freetown. Now, and so what you see in the upper right photograph here is a photograph of the archaeological investigations that took place at Indian fields in the 1970s by archaeologists from the Long Island Archaeology Project. And so this data all belongs to Suffolk County Parks Division of Historic Services. So rather than prove that the house was moved to the Freetown site, what I think the archaeology does is it prevents data that challenges the idea that the house was built on site according to the agreement drawn by Benson's agents. So for one, the dimensions don't match. And secondly, the absence of a stone foundation argues against on-site construction. But finally, the documents that detail Benson's negotiations with the Montauquets are not reflective of what actually happened in the past. For instance, the yearly annuities that were promised to the Montauquets and their descendants were never received. So in addition to addressing the architectural questions through site formation processes, the archaeology gathered information about human lived experience at the site. We were limited by time because the construction crew wanted to get back to work. So we spent 4 long days in the field, excavating between floor beams and collecting archaeological information within 3 roofs: the kitchen, the front living room, and the first floor bedroom. So what you see here are photographs of archaeology in action. I guess the lower left photograph shows archaeology at the very beginning before we started to dig out between the floor beams. Okay, so at this point the floor had been removed from the site. So you see the floor beams that the floor would have sat on, and you can see that dirt is just below, that those beams are sitting on dirt. In the upper left and then the right photograph, you could see after a lot of the excavations have taken place, because you can see that we're standing below the floor beams at that point. So those are the archaeological units that we dug out. So what we did was we mapped and photographed all of those floor joists, okay? And on the right, you can see some of those pieces of wood. You see new wood, which is the frame that's holding up the building, stabilizing the building while the archaeology and the renovations can take place. And on the left is our sketch drawing of the floor beams and how they're laid out inside the house. And what's interesting is you can see that there's some notches that are cut out of some of these floor beams. So there's clearly a lot of repurposed wood in this building, because we wouldn't necessarily expect the wood, if we were using new pieces of wood, they wouldn't be notched out like this. And so one of the members of our descendant community noted that these notches of the joists suggest they may have been repurposed agricultural fencing, which is pictured here on the left at 2 properties in Montauk, which was used as grazing lands for the town. So you have third house and second house shown here with these rail fences, and it's possible that perhaps some of the wood from these fences may have been reused in setting the structure at Freetown. Okay, so we dug units between the floor beams and to gather information about house construction, presence or absence of cellars and subfloor pits, activity areas, and also to document any disturbance that was caused to the site during the construction. So this trench style of archaeology is more typical of archaeology done at urban spaces where archaeologists would have to maximize their investigations in a short amount of time and in tight spaces. Okay, and so the drawing in the center shows the excavation units, which are labeled EU for excavation unit. We dug one here in the back bedroom, one over here in the 2 over here in the kitchen, EU2 and EU5. And then we dug several in the front room, EU 4, 3, and 6. And over here we had stairs, a closet, and another hanging closet over here. Okay, so here you can see in the photo on the left, the ground surface beneath the floor beams in the kitchen before we began excavating. Some artifacts are evident on the surface. The photo on the right shows the space after it was excavated in the same location. So when we dig an excavation unit, like the one you see here, we dig it slowly using shovels and trowels, taking care to document the soil color and texture as we dig in layers across the unit. We dig in shallow levels, taking starting and ending measurements at each level. And we bag the artifacts that we recover from each layer. This allows us to understand at what depth each artifact comes from and helps us to date the site, right? So in general, more recent artifacts would be found closer to the surface. And as you dig down deeper, we would expect to encounter artifacts from earlier times. And for those students who are watching, this is the law of superposition. So we dig in layers until we stop finding artifacts. And this is what we call the subsoil, or a layer of soil that has no evidence of human activity. And then we map the layers that we encountered in our excavation unit. So the drawing that you see on the left is basically what we see in the field and take measurements of after the unit is excavated on the right. So we map out the different layers and the different layers with color and texture of the soils. So when we started the excavation, there were many people who told us we wouldn't find anything but dirt under the floor. And boy, were they wrong. So this photo shows a medicine bottle on the left and a fragment of a Chinese export porcelain teacup on the right that were recovered from the surface layer. And as we dug further down, more and more artifacts were discovered. And so this is really the challenge that we face in explaining the purpose of archaeology, especially at a historic site. We can learn so much from archaeology about household activities, the food people ate, the medicines that they used, the ceramics that they ate from, the toys they played with, and all sorts of other things. So these items can help us to understand the socioeconomics of the site's inhabitants. And also what you see in this photograph at the bottom, this black and white image is a scale. And a scale is used by archaeologists in standard archaeological photography to demonstrate the size of the artifacts in the photograph. This scale in particular is centimeters, where each small square measures 1 centimeter. So at the site, in terms of artifacts, the richest location inside the Fowler house was the kitchen. Let me see if I have a picture of that, which is where this unit was dug, okay? We found lots of different artifacts. We found Prosser buttons, which are China buttons that were manufactured after 1840s, of various shapes and sizes. We found glass buttons, vulcanized rubber buttons, metal buttons. And what's great about these items is that a lot of them can be dated using standard guides from archaeologists and collectors. There was a noticeably high number of shell buttons and also fragments of shell. The shell buttons came in a variety of shapes and sizes, some of which you see here. And there were even some pieces of shell that look like they may have been worked or had evidence of working on them. So it's possible that residents were manufacturing shell buttons on the site. And this is something that we want to explore as we continue to do research. So lost buttons are common on archaeological sites. But in this case, the high number of buttons at the site suggests that sewing may have been done here on a larger scale than for the household. And that's another one of the things that we're interested in researching further here. We do know from descendants' histories that Sarah and her daughter Marguerite, who's pictured here, were very skilled at sewing. And when the house was sort of discovered in 2014, there was a sewing machine still in place up in the upper level of the house. And in addition to the sewing machine, the buttons, we also find several pieces of beads, hair pieces. So some really interesting things associated with activity at the site. Okay. Another really interesting set of artifacts that was recovered are these clay marbles. And here you see there's 7 clay marbles, and this is just a fraction of the marbles that were found at the site. In fact, what's really unique here is that we found more marbles at the site than I have found at all other sites that I've ever worked at in my history as an archaeologist. And so the clay marble, some of them are made out of clay, some of them may have been made out of stone, and they, you know, they're an indication of human activity. We usually associate this with children's activities, as children's toys. And you also see here one die that's made out of bone, which is one of my favorite artifacts from the site. We recovered a fragment of a slate pencil, which is what you see pictured on the left. And on the right is what is basically an example of how a slate pencil would be used, if there's any students tuning in. So the slate pencil would have been an early writing system for instruction at schools in the place of pencils and paper. We also found toy fragments. So here you see a picture of in the photo on the left, you see a fragment of a porcelain doll, it's the foot, and on the right, a small porcelain teacup handle, which was probably part of a children's tea set. So lots of evidence of children's activities at the site. And if we take a look at the census data over the years, we can see the names and the ages of the people who lived in the house. Now, the 1890 federal census doesn't exist for New York, but the 1990 federal census, it would be the first census to list the inhabitants of the Fowler house in Freetown. And at that time, George Fowler was 42 years old and living there with his wife, Sarah. They had 7 children, ranging in age from 22 years to 1 year old, and a grandchild. And although it's possible that all 10 individuals were living in the 15 by 21 foot house, it's also possible that there may have been additional buildings on the site to accommodate, you know, the large number of family members. So other interesting items recovered from the archaeological site include these pieces of tobacco pipes, some of which can be dated and can help us explore, you know, dating at the site. We have lots of pieces of ceramics, broken pieces of plates, cups, teawares. These are very small fragments of, you know, the variety of ceramics found at the site. And one of the things that we'd like to research is if there's any similarities with the ceramics that were used at the Indian field sites. Okay, lots of pieces of bottle glass. On the left, you can see fragments of medicine bottles and a wine bottle fragment. And on the right, some examples of tableware glass. And so these would have been, you know, beverage holders that were possibly used on a dinner table. And they have some interesting etchings that we'd like to take a closer look at as well. So overall, the artifacts, including the toys and the gaming pieces, are all indications of family life, the presence of children, and even adult activities at the site. Now, there was no evidence of a cellar or a subfloor pit or any kind of, you know, subfloor storage. But as you can see, and you can see in these photos of excavation units 3 and 4 on the right, on the left and on the right, the floor beams were supported by boulders in some locations, with no evidence of dugout storage spaces below the floor. But there certainly were storage areas located within the house. And if you take a look at the photo on the upper left, towards the back wall there, you can see some beadboard and the stairs. You take a look at this photo, there was a little cubby hole that was cut out behind the stairs, and this was used as a storage area. It yielded even more artifacts, including a whole pile of shoes, lots of books from the early 20th century, and racing cards. And it even included a wooden box with hundreds of more buttons. Now these materials all seem to date to the more recent past. They date to the, earlier part of the 20th century, but the archaeological deposits beneath the floor were a very discrete context until, until construction began on the site. And that's largely because we think a renovation took place within the house around the 1940s. And the placement of an asbestos tile floor at that time seems to have sealed the spaces between the earlier wood floor. So some of this information can also be explained through census data when there's an absence of people being documented at the site, but it also happens around the time of the 1938 hurricane when a lot of people were displaced. So maybe we're looking at a renovation that took place because of damage to the site during that time. Okay. So there's certainly other things at the site that archaeology can tell us. This view shows the kitchen prior to the gutting of the house and prior to the archaeological investigation. So you can see on the photo on the left, the asbestos tile floor that was installed around the 1930s or 1940s. And above the floor was a sink. And to the rear, you can see a hole covered by loose brush and debris. I'm gonna show you here. Okay, so that hole over here is actually this brick feature that is pictured in the upper right, which is was partially visible from the outside of the house. Okay, and so you can also see it from the so you could see it down here. This is where it would have been. There was a tree that stood here, and then when the tree was removed, it caused some damage to the brick feature, and then the brick feature was removed. And so we were really interested in what this feature was, and how it could have been connected to water use at the site. So when we got to the site for the archaeology, this sink had been removed and the floor had been removed, and this is what we see behind the sink and the floor, okay? And so we investigated this area because we wanted to find out if there was some kind of correlation with the brick feature and with the sink that was established, knowing that the property wasn't hooked up to municipal water, okay? So what you can see is that, well, you can't see it in this photo, but there was a pipe that extended from the sink into the brick feature, which functioned as a dry well to dispel water from the sink. So this, so in the upper right photo here, you can see the sandy soil that was removed after the brick feature was pulled out. We wanted to explore whether that was a well or not, if that was a way for people to access drinking water. It didn't serve in that way. It actually served in a way to throw out gray water after washing dishes or any kind of sink use at the site. And so what we learned also through excavation is that this metal piece here is actually an electric submersible pump that was used to connect a buried water source to the sink. And then the water would come up through the sink, through the faucet. They would use it in the sink, and then they would dispel it by tube into that brick feature on the outside, which was a dry well. And so this could have been used for, washing dishes, washing clothes even. And so even in the mid to late 20th century, people here were never connected to the municipal water systems. Instead, they used this as a residential strategy, still without a bathroom in the house in the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s. And so this picture here is an example of how an electric submersible pump could have been, was installed here to reach down into water very deeply down, and then through pressure, force it up through the sink. Okay. So the archaeological data from the Fowler house sheds light on the lives and lived experiences of the Fowler family and their relatives. The site was likely a gathering place for the Fowlers, their friends, and their kin, some of whom are shown in this photo. Current and former residents of the Freetown neighborhood recall visiting the Fowler house and knowing its residents. So as we learn more about the Fowler house, we also learn more about the activities around the site in Freetown. The Freetown neighborhood in East Hampton is located north of the centralized village of East Hampton. The Freetown neighborhood dates back to the early 19th century, if not earlier. And this is where wealthy landowners like the Gardner and the Osborne families, among others, allocated land for their enslaved workforce, as well as the free people of color who worked for them in the 1800s. Now, when Benson resettled the Montauk Indians there in the 1880s, Freetown was comprised of African American, Native American, and Euro-American households. These were men and women, some of color, who had been descendant of the earliest workforces in East Hampton. And there were also people who arrived during the post-Civil War Great Migration. Now, although Freetown was segregated from the centralized white village to the south, the people who lived in Freetown were the essential workforce in the homes, the shops, the gardens, the agricultural fields, and the garages of the elite white village residents. George Fowler, for instance, was the gardener for Thomas Moran and his wife Mary, who were late 19th century artists, and their studio is preserved today in East Hampton Village. There's the preserved picture right there. So George was a renowned gardener for some very well-to-do families, and he was also remembered for sailing the Moran family in their gondola. The gondola is pictured here. Other residents of the Fowler house include George and Sarah's sons, Norris, William, and George, also known as Jake. They were all veterans of the Great World War I, and they all lived on the site. We also have Marguerite Fowler LaPorte pictured here. You saw her earlier as a child, and here she is as a grown woman. After she married her husband, Joseph Toussaint LaPorte, she moved into the house next door to the Fowler house. And finally, here is a photo of Leonard Horton, the grandson of George and Sarah Fowler. His mother was their daughter, Maria. We don't have a photograph of her yet. Leonard was also a noted gardener in the village. He was the last family member to live in the Fowler house. So I hope that if you get the chance to pass the Fowler house, now you have a better sense of the history that house can tell. I hope I was also able to share how archaeology is useful in building local narratives and shedding light on people's lived experiences at the Fowler house. I want to mention that historical research about the Freetown area and the Fowler site is ongoing. And I have many collaborators and people to thank for sharing their knowledge and their efforts to preserve this important site. They include Mr. James Devine and Chief Robert Farrow, especially, for doing all they do to ensure this house is preserved and its story is told. Together, the three of us have established the Friends of the Fowler group, along with community members from the East Hampton Historical Society, the East Hampton Historical Farm Museum, the Eastville Community Historical Society, and Preservation Long Island. We are all especially thankful for the work that Supervisors Van Scoyac and Cantwell before him have done to ensure that this site is landmarked and preserved. And we thank the East Hampton Town trustees too for their support. So this ongoing research project engages various stakeholders and members of the community in ethnographic and mapping research of the Freetown neighborhood. And this is done through the Mapping Memories of Freetown project, a collaboration between Farmingdale State College and the Friends of the Fowler House group. Thanks to Dr. Anjana Mabani Cruz, Jim Devine, and Chief Robert Farrow for their ongoing efforts with this research. We're also working with Andrea at the East Hampton Library to establish a Freetown archive. And if you would like to stay in touch and learn more about our Freetown work, you can check out our Friends of Fowler Facebook page, which, you know, we keep updates. We should provide more updates, but, you know, we're trying. And feel free to reach out to us through email at thefriendsofthefowlerhouse@gmail.com. Okay, so Andrea?
I'm going to take questions. If for some reason you can't figure out how to indicate in chat that you would like a question, I'll direct them to Allison. We'll unmute people one at a time. If for some reason you can't make the chat feature work, just kind of raise your hand like you're back in school, because that's the only other thing I can come up with at this point. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, and I'm expecting there will be questions. It just indicates that you'd like to ask a question. We can unmute you so you can ask your question. Any questions? Remember to make sure your video is showing if you're trying to raise your hand. All right. No questions at all.
Oh, we have somebody, we have Carol.
Oh, there we go.
Yep.
Okay, let's see. Carol, I'm looking for you in here. There we go. Hi, Carol. You want to go ahead and ask Allison your question?
Yes, please. Dr. McGovern, have you done any biological or chemical testing of the site to compare that site from whence the house came? You suspect the house came from the Indian, what do you call the Indian?
Indian Fields?
Yeah.
Right. So no, there hasn't been any dendrochronology, which would be, testing of the age of the wood inside the house. That hasn't been done, and there hasn't been any soil testing at the site. I'm not sure how useful at this time soil testing would be to be able to tell us anything about the building's movement to the site. The soil testing would provide us better information about, say, activity areas and maybe even plantings, which is something that we're interested in at the site.
Okay, and how about the wood testing? How about that?
So that's dendrochronology, and that hasn't been done yet either. But the preservationist who's working on that house in who's involved in that house in East Hampton, I'm pretty sure that he has samples of materials from the interior of the house. So it's certainly something that could be considered in the future.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's see. Are there any other questions, either in chat or hands raised? I'm looking through each screen. I don't see anybody else. Do you see anyone, Allison? Because I may be missing somebody. I may be on the wrong screen. Oh, Ray. I'm going to unmute you. Let's see. There we go. Hi, Ray.
Hi. So my question is, Allison, what's your methodology for figuring out where you would dig these test pits?
Well, thanks, Ray. Ordinarily we would pick a sampling strategy so that we could test different areas systematically. Like we might test along a grid, and so there's grid guidelines that are established by the New York Archaeological Council for testing a site. This site is a little bit unusual because we were limited to the space inside the house. No testing was taking place outside of the house. And so we had to make quick decisions about how we could recover enough useful information from the space while we were in there. So we did what's called judgmental testing, where we wanted to take samples of different activity areas within the site. So that's why we picked sections of each of the different rooms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see. Anybody else? We have praise from a couple people that have been coming through. A lot of people have been commenting how much they've liked the presentation. Karen, let me unmute you so you can ask your question directly so I don't screw anything up here. Reverend Karen's right here. Let me unmute her. Let's see. Why is it not kicking you off? There we go. You should be good to go.
Hi, I was interested in you said there were bricks from a well that were taken off the site. Mm-hmm. So was there a well?
Right, so yeah, there was a brick dry well on the site. Let me show you where it is. I'm still sharing, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so what you see here, yeah, I sort of jumbled a little bit while I was talking, but right here in the upper right was this brick drywall feature. It was a circle, okay, and so it was lined with brick down below the ground surface. We didn't get to take any measurements of the depth of that structure or the diameter of the structure before it was removed, but it raised a lot of questions for us about whether this was something that was used, if this was a well to reach water or if it was a dry well which again would be for when you're throwing out dirty water. Mm-hmm. And so the proximity of it to the sink where the electric submersible pump was really pointed to the indication that this is where dirty water was being thrown out, and it was sort of partially outside of the house, which is hard to see here in this picture. Mm-hmm. You have a lot of brush over here.
In your experience of older houses, Are trapezoidal bricks, handmade bricks, typical in wells?
Trapezoidal bricks, you know, I don't know. That's something that I'd have to take a closer look at.
I have a wonderful picture of a well that was on a property next to the Pharaohs in Eastville, and the property was bulldozed, and I had been fighting for an archaeological dig because it had been 60 years since anybody had touched the soil. It was about a 200-year-old house, and we
Well-
lost, but I have a picture of the well.
Well, if you can reach out to me through email, I'll put my contact information up, or you can reach out through
I'll be happy to introduce you two by email.
Great, thank you so much.
Yes.
Let's see, are there any other questions? I've had really good questions so far. Am I missing anybody? I don't see any hands. I don't see anything in chat. Oh, all right. Carol has another question.
Dr. McGovern, what got you interested in studying Indians? Are you yourself Indian?
No, I'm not. I don't have any indigenous ancestry. So when I started learning about archaeology, I was in Hunter College at the time, and I was taking some anthropology courses, and I just really got interested in what you can learn about the past through archaeology. One of the first projects that I worked on was the New York African Burial Ground Project, which was a burial project in downtown Manhattan of the small area that was excavated had more than 400 burials at the site. And that was just a fraction of the site. And so it was during that process that I realized how interesting New York history was, and how there was so much about the past, especially about people who have been poorly documented in history, that we could learn about more through archaeology. And so that's how I got interested in this topic. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm looking for any other questions from the audience right now. This
Karen
person,
again.
I actually see another question for somebody that I don't think has asked a question. The speaker is just showing up his iPhone in my messages here. So I'm just trying to figure out which iPhone user this is, so that I can unmute this person and they can ask their question directly. This person's asking if it's possible, if Dr. McGovern believes state and federal recognition is possible for the Montauk, and I'm just trying to find this person. I'm sorry. We have a bunch of different views here. iPhone, I just don't see where the iPhone just says iPhone. Oh, it says Laura Cook. I'm sorry, Laura. I'm looking for you in here. Oh gosh. Now I'm feeling silly because we just have so many people in here. I'm just missing her name. I'm so sorry. Allison, if you want to go ahead and answer the question, and I'll just see if I can find a way to unmute Laura while you're talking.
Is the question in chat?
It is, but it was sent to me directly. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy it over to everyone.
Okay.
And then hopefully while I'm doing that, we can find a way to unmute Laura, because I'm just having trouble finding her in here. Not everyone appears the same way their name appears.
Okay, so the question is, do you believe state and federal recognition is possible for the Montaukets? So this is a tough question. I think the Montaukets have a very strong case for state level recognition and federal recognition. And I think that right now the Montaukets are very active in trying to regain that tribal status from New York State. So I can't predict how it's going to, what the outcome will be, but I do believe that that this is definitely possible. And it's sites like the Fowler site that, that help to support the case that the Montaukets, to help with representing Montauk tribal recognition through the 21st century. So yeah.
Laura is unmuted. I did manage to find her and unmute her while you were answering. So Laura, if you wanted to follow up, you can speak. All right, I don't think I hear.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Dr. McGovern.
Thank you.
And then I heard that there was a question from Reverend Karen. I'm sorry, I'm looking through trying to find you. There you are. Did you still want to ask your question?
My question was, Leonard had no descendants. Is that correct? Or
Oh,
are there more descendants of the family?
there are certainly still relatives. Yes, there's certainly descendants that are around. And so one person who's really important to this research is Mr. Jim Devine. He is a descendant. I'm sorry, let me just close something out. Are you still there?
Yes.
Okay. So he's a descendant, and he has, an excellent record of the connections between family and friends at the site. So we're continuing to research that.